When I first purchased the property, I envisioned a quiet, comfortable home where I could both live and work in peace. It wasn't just another house to me. It was the culmination of years of saving, strategizing, and carefully choosing the right location for a long-term investment. The neighborhood on the surface seemed perfect. The lawns were neatly manicured, the sidewalks were well maintained, and the streets carried the kind of calm that suggested stability and safety. Yet hidden beneath that polished surface was an undercurrent of control and pettiness embodied in one person, Karen, the head of the homeowners association. From the moment I moved in, she made it her personal mission to monitor my every move, as though my presence alone was an offense against her carefully curated vision of the neighborhood. The first confrontation was deceptively small. I had parked my truck in the driveway overnight after unloading some furniture. It wasn't blocking anyone's view or breaking any obvious rule, yet the very next morning, I woke to a notice taped to my door citing me for extended driveway parking. Shrugged it off at first, assuming it was a simple misunderstanding. But the tone of the letter was already unusually hostile. A day later, I caught Karen pacing outside my house, arms folded, glaring at my vehicle as if it were a crime scene. That's when I realized this wasn't about rules, it was about her obsession with control. Every little thing became ammunition in her battle against me. The shade of paint I chose for the shutters, the flowers I planted along the walkway. Even the length of time my porch light stayed on in the evenings. As weeks went by, her behavior escalated beyond petty complaints. Karen had a habit of showing up uninvited, rapping on my door with the kind of impatience usually reserved for law enforcement, and demanding explanations for things that were none of her business. She criticized the way I trimmed my hedges, claimed my recycling bins were out of alignment with community standards, and once insisted I move my welcome mat because it clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. At first, I humored her, trying to keep the peace, but every concession only emboldened her. Soon, she began weaponizing the HOA's bylaws, cherry-picking obscure clauses and stretching them to apply to situations that clearly didn't fit. The most infuriating part was her knack for summoning authority to back up her crusade. One Saturday evening, as I grilled burgers in the backyard with a single friend, the flashing lights of a police car appeared outside my home. The officer explained that a noise complaint had been filed. Confused, I asked how anyone could have mistaken the quiet hum of a small barbecue for a disturbance. The officer, somewhat sheepish, admitted that the call had come directly from Karen. It wasn't the last time either. Over the course of a few months, she called the police no fewer than 4 times each, one more ridiculous than the last. Once it was for an unauthorized gathering, when I was simply hosting my sister and her children for dinner. Another time she claimed my dog was dangerous, even though he was a gentle, elderly retriever who barely lifted his head to bark. Each incident ended the same way. The police, growing increasingly irritated at the frivolous calls, left after finding nothing wrong. But the damage to my sense of peace was already done. Living under constant surveillance and harassment changed the way I moved through my own home. I found myself second-guessing simple decisions like whether to park on the street for a few hours or whether to mow the lawn at 8 a.m. instead of 10. I drew my blinds more often, aware of her watchful eyes from across the cul-de-sac. Neighbors, too, began to distance themselves, afraid of being caught in Karen's web of judgment if they associated with me too openly. It became clear that her influence through the HOA extended like a shadow over the entire community. People, I realized, complied with her demands not because they agreed with her, but because they feared the relentless harassment that came with standing up to her. Yet, despite all of this, I didn't back down. What Karen never understood was that this house wasn't just my residence, it was part of a larger investment portfolio. I had chosen this property specifically because of its location and potential, and I wasn't about to let her petty antics push me out. Every time she called the cops, I documented it. Every notice she sent, I filed away. Every outlandish accusation, I kept on record. I began to see the pattern clearly. She wasn't protecting the neighborhood, she claimed, but rather satisfying her own need for control by targeting the newest homeowner who hadn't bowed to her authority. the breaking point for me came. One afternoon when I returned from work to find Karen standing in my yard with two other HOA board members, pointing at my mailbox as though it were a national security threat. She accused me of violating community standards because my mailbox wasn't the same shade of beige as the others. Despite the fact that it had been installed by the previous owner years before I moved in, when I pointed this out, she dismissed it, insisting that rules are rules. The other board members shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the absurdity, but unwilling to challenge her in public. At that moment, I realized something crucial. Karen wasn't just difficult, she thrived on intimidation and relied on people's silence to maintain her power, instead of feeling defeated. She believed she was sabotaging my life, but in reality, she was exposing her own obsession and carelessness. The more she pushed, the more ammunition she gave me. Behind her endless harassment, she hadn't once considered who she was really dealing with. I wasn't just another neighbor she could bully into submission. I was her landlord. She was living on my property under my terms, though she hadn't pieced it together yet. That knowledge simmered quietly in the back of my mind as I endured her constant attacks, and it gave me the patience to let her play out. Her hand by the time the police had been called for the fourth time, and the HOA board had delivered its fifth baseless warning. I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth would come crashing down on her. Until then, I endured the constant battle, not as a victim, but as someone biding his time. Each glare from across the street, each knock on my door, and each frivolous complaint was just another step closer to the moment she would discover the reality she'd been blind to all along, that the very person she was tormenting was the one person she could least afford to alienate. The day everything unraveled for Karen began like any other, at least for her. For me, it was the moment I had been waiting for, the inevitable turning point after months of enduring her hostility. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the street in long shadows, when I heard the familiar sound of her heels clicking against the pavement. She stormed up my walkway with a manila folder tucked under her arm, expression on her face equal parts triumph and self-righteous fury. I opened the door before she had the chance to knock, and the look of surprise on her face quickly twisted into the condescending smirk I had grown accustomed to. "I hope you're prepared," she said without even greeting me, thrusting the folder into my hands. "The HOA board has reviewed my latest complaints, and you're in violation of at least 3 bylaws. Fines will be imposed, and if you don't comply, further action will be taken." Her words dripped with satisfaction, like she had finally landed the killing blow in the battle she had been waging since the day I arrived. I took the folder, flipped it open, and scanned the pages inside. As expected, it was the same nonsense. Claims about my mailbox color, accusations about supposed noise violations, and some invented nonsense about my landscaping. I closed the folder slowly, looked her in the eye, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I smiled. "Karen," I said calmly, "do you know who your landlord is?" For a second, the smugness lingered. She opened her mouth to fire back some remark, but then the words caught in her throat. Her brow furrowed as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she didn't even know existed. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice sharper than usual. I leaned casually against the doorframe, letting the silence stretch between us before answering. "The rent check you write every month, the one you've been so diligent about delivering due, you know. Where it goes, whose name is on the account." The color drained from her face almost instantly. She blinked, searching her memory, no doubt replaying every rent transaction, every envelope dropped into a mailbox, every automatic withdrawal she had authorized. She'd always treated the landlord as a distant figure, someone faceless and far removed from the community. It's the kind of person she assumed she could complain to if her tenant's behavior ever got out of hand. Now, realization began to dawn, and with it came a visible crack in her carefully maintained armor of superiority. You're saying," she stammered, her voice suddenly weak. "Yes," I interrupted, my tone firm but controlled. "Your landlord, this house, the one you've been paying rent for, belongs to me. In every dollar you've handed over, every time you thought you were fighting me as a neighbor, you were, in fact, biting the hand that keeps a roof over your head." The silence that followed was delicious. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she was gasping for air, but no words came out. For the first time, she wasn't the one dictating the conversation. She wasn't standing on her soapbox of authority, backed by her beloved bylaws. She was vulnerable, exposed, and utterly powerless. I could see the calculation in her eyes as she tried to process the consequences of her actions. If I were vindictive enough, I could terminate her lease, and she would be out on the street in a matter of weeks. All of her imagined power over me was nothing more than a house of cards, and with one revelation I had blown it down. I didn't know, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. The arrogance was gone, replaced with something that looked a lot like fear. I know. You didn't, I replied evenly. But maybe you should have thought about who you were dealing with before you went out of your way to sabotage me. Do you have any idea how many reports I've documented? How many police visits I've logged with your name attached to them? Do you realize how this all looks when put together in a file? Her eyes widened and she shook her head, clearly realizing how close she was to losing not just the upper hand but her home entirely. The bravado that had defined her for so long melted away, leaving only desperation. She began to sputter apologies, each one more frantic than the last. I didn't mean. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. It was never personal, Karen. I cut her off again, this time with steel in my voice. Everything you did was personal. You targeted me, harassed me, and tried to ruin my life. And now you've discovered that the one person you should have been treating with respect is the person who has more power over your life than you ever imagined. The conversation ended with her retreating down my walkway, no longer stomping with confidence but shuffling like someone who had been dealt a crushing blow. From that day forward, the dynamic shifted entirely. Karen, once the terror of the neighborhood, became invisible. She stopped lurking outside my house. She stopped filing complaints. The police no longer appeared at my door with sheepish smiles. Even the HOA board seemed quieter, perhaps sensing that their ringleader had lost her teeth. What struck me most was how quickly the neighborhood's atmosphere changed. Without Karen's constant meddling, the other residents began to relax. They waved more often, struck up conversations, even invited me to gatherings that had previously been closed circles. It was as though everyone had been waiting for someone to stand up to her, to reveal that her authority was nothing more than bluster. Ow. And though I hadn't planned it that way, I had become the catalyst for her downfall. Karen, meanwhile, kept her distance. I would see her occasionally scurrying from her car to her front door, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground. Gone were the condescending lectures, the passive-aggressive comments, the smug tone. She had been humbled in the harshest way possible by learning that the neighbor she had tried to destroy was the very person holding the keys to her future. She lived in constant uncertainty now, knowing that at any moment I could decide she had overstayed her welcome. The balance of power had shifted irrevocably, and she knew it. In the months that followed, I never raised her rent, never evicted her, never exercised the full weight of the authority I held. I didn't need to. The revelation alone had been punishment enough. Every day she lived in that house was a reminder of her own arrogance, a daily lesson in humility. And for me, the victory wasn't just in silencing her, it was in reclaiming the peace she had stolen from me. My home once again became the sanctuary I had envisioned when I first bought it. And the constant battle that had defined my early days in the neighborhood became nothing more than a memory. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me from her window, her expression unreadable. Maybe it was resentment, maybe regret, maybe both, but it didn't matter anymore. The war was over, and I had won without lifting a finger. All it had taken was the truth she never saw coming, and won that. Ensured she would never dare cross me again.